What's cracking, everybody, and welcome back to another disappointingly early Kraken offseason. And as we do at the start of every Kraken offseason, or around the start of every Kraken offseason, or about a week into this one now, we're going to do some player grades. And while last season I was maybe a bit generous, especially given how the season went, this season it's taken a step back from that. Now, depending on your point of view, maybe I'm still being a little bit generous, but yeah, it's not nearly as high of grades on net as we had last year. But with that, since we have quite a few players to get through, let's get into it. So starting then on the forward end, we might as well begin with the first line center in Matty Beneers, who did have, in pretty much every single way, a slightly better season than last year, where I'm pretty sure I gave him a B. But I think in a lot of ways, especially with it being another year farther down the road and last year already being kind of disappointing, a sophomore slump for him, we were certainly hoping for and maybe even expecting him to get closer to back to what he was in that Calder winning rookie season. And while he did get back to 20 goals, he still was under in pretty much every way what he did in that first year. Now he is playing full on first line minutes, unlike he did in that first year where it took the league kind of half the season to catch up to him. But still, I think especially considering that it is, like I said, a year farther into his career, and coming into the season, his contract kicked in that made him the highest paid forward on the team, it's fair to have expected a little bit more than that slight jump up that we saw. Now, with that having been said, and even though, yeah, if you were to just look at his offensive output numbers on the season, it would be hard to give him much more than somewhere in the C range for a grade. He is still one of the best defensive players in the league, and certainly one of the best defensive forwards in the NHL. So especially considering that it is still his third season in the league, and he also got nearly a minute more ice time per night, still playing that first line role against pretty much the best line that any team has to offer at any given time. The defensive side of the game right now can make up for a lot of what's lacking or taking some time to develop on the offensive side, and it is also true that he ended the season on a good note. Things certainly started to take a turn for the better once they made that trade for Kako, and the two of them got used to playing with each other for the first week or so. Beneers' game certainly elevated with Kako and that line, and hopefully that's a good sign for things going forward, that with a full season of Kako and Beneers probably together next year, and whoever they get to be on the other side of that wing, I think there's some reason to be hopeful that the offensive side of the game can come along, and between the two, it's nice to see that he already has that defensive side on lockdown. For now, I'll just give him a slight bump down from last year to a B-, which is largely just to do with I am going to take into consideration how much the player is making. If a player is making over $7 million, you do want to see, especially for your first line center, more offensive production, even if they are very good on the defensive end. Now, if the offensive game just never really quite gets to that anywhere near elite level for Beneers, then he could down the road be a very solid, defensively strong second line center for the Kraken, part of a lockdown line that they can send out there, and still with some offensive upside. But especially with where he's at on that first line right now, they will, if they want to get into a playoff hunt next year, need some more offensive production out of him. And if they don't get that, this grade will continue to slip, even with the defensive prowess that he has. Moving on, though, as we try to get through this in some kind of a timely manner, I'll stay on that line and move out to the wing with the one guy that I think is a pretty good bet as a lock to at least start the season on Beneers' line, and that would be Kako. Now, as we know, Kako did not start the season with the Kraken. He was acquired via trade as the Kraken sent Borggan in December to New York to get Kako in return. And at least with the Kraken, he had a pretty good season, especially considering he only cost the Kraken a little bit over $2 million, which I kind of have to bet is likely to go up as he hopefully gets re-signed here at some point in the next few days or few weeks as we get into the offseason. Now with the Kraken having less to focus on and Kako having less to focus on, they can get that contract worked out. But at least as far as how he played on the ice, he and Beneers, again, as I just talked about with Beneers, really seemed to mesh well together and elevated each other's game, as Kako saw not only a significant increase in his playing time in Seattle from what he was getting with the Rangers, but also a significant increase in his production as he well over doubled what he did in points with the Rangers in his time in Seattle. And sure, the defensive side of his game leaves a little bit to be desired. There's some work to be done potentially on that, and it was a bit up and down even in his time with the Kraken, though not quite as bad as how things were going with the Rangers even there. But it does help that Beneers is as good as he is defensively, so that makes up for a little bit of Kakko's flaws there. And certainly, offensively, Kaapo's ability to get in on the forecheck, get a puck away, and start some offensive zone time for the Kraken certainly helps open up some space and get possession and time in the offensive end for a guy like Beneers to finally start using some of those offensive skills that he does have and just hasn't really been able to showcase nearly as much since his rookie season, with more ice being taken away from him from opposing teams, or by opposing teams. So I think it's pretty safe to say that we all pretty well liked what we saw from Kakko offensively with the Kraken this season, even if maybe as he got a little bit more comfortable with his role in the team, there were a few times where you might have liked to see him take a shot rather than force a pass, but I mean, that's not a complaint that can be only levied against Kakko as far as Kraken players really throughout the team's history, and he's certainly not as egregious an offender of passing more than shooting as maybe some of the other players. And as far as the defensive side of things, well, like I said, it could use some improvement. The Kraken numbers defensively pretty much across the board, really aside from Matty Beneers, were not fantastic, which maybe even says a little bit more about just how good defensively Beneers was for the Kraken, but it certainly could explain a little bit of Kakko's defensive struggles here and there with the team. Just in general, the team was not very good defensively over the course of the season. So then as far as the grade is concerned, I think it all kind of balances out to somewhere around an A-, maybe an A, considering again, he was only costing the Kraken about $2 million as far as what they were responsible for his contract. And given his production and especially being a big part of the first line, a decently producing first line winger for $2 million is a pretty good deal. Yeah, maybe we could go with an A. And that brings us to the other side of that line, at least for most of the season anyway, in Jaden Schwarz, who just alone for the fact that he played 81 of the 82 games, a pretty healthy season, especially by his own standards. I mean, that alone I almost want to give him an A+ for. But then he also led the team in goals with 26, which is more goals than he's scored in 10 years since he was 22, when he put up 28 goals, but the second most goals he's put up in a single season. And just in general, a great season from Jaden Schwarz. Again, the defensive side, his numbers don't look fantastic. As far as the team as a whole is concerned, they're maybe a little bit below average. So if you wanted to bump him down to an A for not having an absolutely perfect season, I suppose fair enough. The defensive side, maybe you can go there, but offensive production for Schwarz was absolutely fantastic. And if there's a guy on the team where you can look at what he did for the Kraken this season and kind of assume that that's the best it's going to get, it would be Jaden Schwarz. He definitely gave the Kraken maybe not a career year, but considering where he's at in his career, something pretty akin to a career season, and especially considering the health that he had this season. Yeah, one of the better seasons of his career. And yeah, hopefully that can continue, or at least get vaguely around that range again next season. We'll just have to wait and see, I suppose, what role he plays and whether or not this newfound health that he had and durability can carry on to next season as well. So then as we continue working our way down the lineup, that would take us down to the second line, which is where things get a bit murky. It's hard to say exactly what the second line is, but for the sake of argument and to keep things moving along, we'll say that generally speaking, the second line center this season was Chandler Stevenson, who did have a season of two halves. The first half of his season, without question, was an absolute F. He was not producing much of anything offensively for the Kraken, and was maybe even the worst defensive player in the entire NHL. For everything that the Kraken, and apparently a lot of other teams, think about Daniel Sprong's play defensively, Chandler Stevenson was all of that, and much, much worse. In some ways, I mean, Sprong kind of would just float around the defensive end somewhat helplessly. Stevenson, in a lot of cases, seemed to be actively hurting the Kraken in their own end of the ice, really through the new year. At which point, the defensive side of his game never really got better per se, but it wasn't as bad as it had been over the first half. It kind of just leveled off, didn't really start going up. He wasn't playing great defense, but he also wasn't playing terrible defense. He still finishes the year in the bottom 4% or so of players defensively, according to advanced metrics. Offensively, though, his game did take a significant step up in the back half of the season, where he became one of the leading scorers for the Kraken, finishing the team second in assists with 38, just one behind Jared McCann's 39, and with third place, Vince Dunn with 28, well in the rearview mirror. So that did save his season to some degree, but again, considering we're not even going to think about the length of the contract, that really doesn't have an effect on the single season, which is what we're focused on right now. But he still is the second highest paid forward on this team. And you really need a lot more of you just need a lot more of certainly consistency and a more well-rounded game. At the very least, if you're going to be at least remotely that bad defensively, you need to be much better offensively. And while I don't think the Kraken could have expected much more offensively than what they ended up getting from him on the season as a whole, right around where he was last season with Vegas, a team that's much better offensively. And yeah, part of that, I guess, maintaining his offensive numbers even with a less offensive team was that he played a much larger role with the Kraken than he was with Vegas. He had, by almost a full minute, more time on ice per game than any other Kraken forward, with Beneers second to him, 19 and a half minutes for Stevenson. You just need better defensive play. And I mean, if we're being honest, he probably would like a little bit more than 13 goals from your $6.25 million second line center. But if you're going to put up, I don't know, 40 to 50 assists and maybe even 50 plus, I think it's excusable. And if he can consistently play next season the way he did the back half of this season, maybe he gets there. Actually, he probably does get there if he plays a full season the way he did the back half of this season offensively. Defensively, though, they really need to see a little bit more of the Chandler Stevenson that they were expecting, and not the Chandler Stevenson that was a downright liability for the majority of the season. All in all, though, as far as the grade is concerned for the season as a whole, well, I do think there's going to be some people that would like to see a little bit lower of a grade than this, and honestly, I don't blame you. I think he earned his way back up to, we'll say, a C, maybe C-, especially considering his face-off numbers weren't quite what I think the Kraken were hoping for. Over 50%, definitely the best face-off taker for the Kraken, and that's a lot of the reason that he got as much ice time as he did. The Kraken sent him out for a lot of face-offs in the offensive or defensive end. Now, especially considering how things were going for him defensively through the first half of the season, I think there was some justification for not putting Stevenson out there because, I mean, sure, he might win the majority, just slightly the majority of face-offs in your end of the ice, but if he loses the other half and then hurts you in the defensive end, you got the opposing team basically on a power play, so that's far from ideal. That may be more of a coaching thing necessarily, but that is why Stevenson was brought in, to be the guy that they could count on going and winning a face-off, and then even if he didn't, at least not hurting the team actively on the ice once that face-off is lost. So, in a lot of ways, a failure of a season, but at least he was the second leading scorer for the Kraken. And for me, it's hard to give him much less than we'll say C to C-, considering he was one of the few Kraken players that was a significant portion of them actually getting pucks into the net. Speaking of which, as we move over to the wing of the second line, or sometimes the center, maybe with third line, either way, the leading scorer of the team, once again, Jared McCann, who had another fantastic offensive season for the Kraken. Maybe not as much with the goal scoring. It is the fewest goals he's scored for the Kraken in the 4 seasons he's been with them. But for the 4th season in a row, he also had a new career high in assists. As I already said, 39 assists for McCann. Even though he wasn't able to quite keep that goal scoring pace up, especially with the large drought through January and most of February, he still found ways to help the Kraken get on the board. And for McCann also, a respectable season defensively, at least as far as the Kraken are concerned, relative to the rest of the team. He actually had a pretty good season defensively. So another solid season, and another season where that contract really looks like one heck of a deal. Kraken have a couple more years to take advantage of that before McCann will either want to go somewhere else, depending on where the Kraken are at, or for the Kraken to, well, he's probably going to end up having to get a raise if this keeps going. Especially considering that even with the one downside of the season that McCann had being that lack of goal scoring, and really the only reason that I'm giving him an A rather than an A+, I don't expect that to continue as we go forward, as he did have a pretty significantly lower shooting percentage than we've seen his entire time with the Kraken, but really even over the course of his career. a just under 11 shooting percentage, where for the Kraken, he'd been shooting well above 13%, and the season he scored 40, he was up around 19, which is a little bit too much the other direction. But I think we can expect, especially considering he also, during that drought, seemed to lose a little bit of confidence in the shot and just wasn't shooting as much as we would expect him to do, as that shooting percentage just regresses upwards back towards his average, and we see him shoot a little bit more as a result of that goal scoring coming along. I would say that somewhere around 30 goals is probably what we can expect in the next couple of seasons. And yeah, for the Kraken, if he can keep up the assists and get those goals and end up somewhere around maybe a point per game optimistically, that could be a big help for this team going forward. At least for the next couple seasons anyway, until he starts getting into his 30s. But at least for now, things are going well for McCann, and this season, even with fewer goals, really was no exception. Meanwhile, on the other wing, or at least at points in the season anyway, at this point we're just kind of making up where players go, as it seemed they kind of were throughout points of the season themselves. But Andre Burkovski, things just keep seeming to go from bad to worse for him. Now, he did finish the season on a high note. He really seemed to pick things up over the last couple weeks of the season, right as we were kind of hoping that the team wouldn't pick things up. But at least he ended the season on a bit of a high note, and hopefully that can carry into next season. I think that he probably played well enough that the Kraken won't go with the buyout option, which, given how the rest of the season went, I think certainly was on the table as we got into that last month. But also probably not good enough that he's really going to draw that much as far as trade interest is concerned. So if I had to bet on it, I would say that Burkovski is probably a part of the team next season. They just won't see it as being worth the dead cap hit to buy his contract out and try and replace him. And I suppose some of that might have to do with who they think they could replace that spot on the roster with. But for Burkovski, even with that strong finish to the season, it really was too little too late. I'm still going to end up going with a D for Burkovski this season. I mean, honestly, that strong finish that got him up to 27 assists, which still was fourth best on the team, is really the only reason that I don't have him with a failing grade. It's just another tough year, as it really seems like, unfortunately, after he was the leading point scorer halfway through his first season with the Kraken, that big injury or two big injuries that he had that cost him half of the last two seasons really seemed to have completely derailed things with him with the Kraken, or just his career in general. He just has had a really hard time finding his game again. And whether it's on the offensive side of things or the defensive end, it just has not come back together for Burkovski. Now, if the Kraken do keep him around for next season, hopefully he can use some of the strong end of this last year to build some confidence that maybe his game is starting to come back, and that can at least get him back to some of what the Kraken thought they were getting when they signed him in free agency a few years ago. But at least for this season, really the best thing that could be said about Burkovski, and depending on who you are, maybe you're not even thinking that this is a good thing, is that he was able to stay healthy, played 79 of the 82 games. So at least he was out there eating up minutes, and it's not like I think the Kraken really had a particularly better option to replace him with. I don't think, in spite of how well he played at the end of the season, that a full season of Yanni Newman would necessarily have been the best thing for either Newman or the Kraken. So it's not like you're going to sit Burkovski with the contract that he has, which is another big part of the reason. I mean, the points he puts up, if he was making around league minimum or something like that, it's a respectable year, but yeah, with the contract that he has, the Kraken need a lot more than what they were getting for most of the season. The Kraken were paying him about $1 million per goal, which is pretty bad. And that brings us to Shane Wright, who did have a pretty good season. Right out of the gate, I'm just going to say it. I think an A- is about right for Wright. If he had played maybe a little bit better defensively, we could be talking about an A, maybe even an A+ for his first full year in the NHL. 79 games with just the 3 games that he was a healthy scratch, which seemed to really turn things around for him. For a long time, he was flirting with a point per game after that healthy scratch in the middle of November. He finishes the season still, even with the tough start that he had, over a half point per game, 44 points in those 79 games with 19 goals and 25 assists, which did make him, by the way, 4th in total points on the team, which may be a bit of a problem in its own right. But for Wright, a good year, that one goal away from a 20-goal season, and he certainly would have got there if he could have maybe seen a little bit more playing time than the 14 minutes of average ice time per game, which was a little bit more kind of between 15 and 16 towards the end of the season. But really, that's the only complaint I could have for Wright, is that they seem to still be, even as we got towards the end of the season, with the exception of a game here and there due to injuries in other parts of the lineup, it really did seem like he was kind of still getting babied along by, I don't know if it's the coaching staff or direction from the front office or what. I would have liked to see, especially once the season didn't really matter, them give him a little bit of a bigger, more consistent role. We talked about that throughout the R&Rs as it was happening, and hopefully they've seen enough now to earn Wright a little bit of a bigger role going into next season, though there certainly is the issue of the log jam at center as far as the top lines are concerned. I don't think you're really looking anywhere else other than Matty Beneers for the first line center, at least at this point in time anyway. And then with Chandler Stevenson, if he is going to start scoring a little bit more, and considering he's still the best at taking faceoffs, I don't think we're going to see a huge drop in ice time for him, unless he just goes back to playing as bad as he started this last season. Either way, as far as Wright is concerned, this season was a pretty good one for him to start out his NHL career in earnest. And although he was not eligible for the Calder and wouldn't win it even if he was, it was a respectable year. Really, the only downside is that, well, as you're usually to expect with a younger player, especially as young as Wright is, now in a first full year, the defensive side of the game, there were some learning points. Kind of 1 to 2 noticeably bad defensive mistakes every game from Wright, and that will have to get cleaned up, but that'll come with experience, and certainly some more consistency as far as his line mates and how much of what role he's playing on the team any given night, I think would help that along a bit. But at least a good starting point for Wright, and certainly 19 goals, a pretty good starting point offensively. He did produce pretty well for the Kraken offensively, just the defensive side is something for him to work on. I suppose maybe the one thing offensively to note here is that he did have a just north of 20 shooting percentage, which is quite a bit higher than your average player, and I do think that the style of game that Wright plays offensively lends itself to a higher than average shooting percentage. Maybe not quite 20% is something he can sustain over the course of a career, but he does play a type of offensive game where he's going to produce by being, especially as we saw towards the end of the season, he likes to go around the net and especially likes to find ways to get lost in the defensive shuffle of the opposing team and find himself empty or in empty ice for open passes and shots that are going to have a higher chance of going in off cross-seam shots or maybe just camping out on the back door, what have you. Again, his style of game, I think, lends itself to a bit of a higher shooting percentage, so I wouldn't necessarily expect you to be... I wouldn't think that you'd have to expect that shooting percentage to come all the way back down to league average, even if it's not going to be quite 20% over the course of his career going forward. Up next, we have Tolvin, who I do have to say I think is getting a bit shortchanged by the analytical stat card here via Hockey Stat Cards online, a great place to look for your advanced stats, at least as much as we have publicly available anyway. But Dom Decision's model, a pretty good one, so quick plug for that. I've been using it. I mean, you see all the hockey cards here for each of the players, but I do think, Tolvin had a significantly better offensive season than I think he's getting credit for here, especially considering, 23 goals did have him second place on the team, which, maybe you'd like second place to be a little bit more than 23 goals. But for Tolvin, a fantastic season producing offensively, at least, especially given that he was largely in a third-line role pretty much the whole season, and even a third-line role where his line mates varied wildly throughout the season, and he never really saw that much time on the power play, which, I mean, especially with the shot that he has, you probably would have expected, and the struggles the Kraken had on the power play, that he would have gotten a little bit more of a look on the power play. It's certainly something that we well know Eddie Olczyk would like to see a lot more of the Kraken using him and that shot as a one-time threat on one of the sides of the power play. But either way, Tolvin still 23 goals without much time skating out there with the man advantage, and just in that third line role, he took pretty good advantage of his role to produce offensively. Defensively, again, I don't think that side necessarily is getting that shortchanged on. As far as, again, relative to the Kraken, his defensive numbers are actually fairly decent, but you'd really like to see all of that, and it's going to take a team effort. It's not like I mean, I don't think individually any one of these players had as necessarily bad as a defensive season as those numbers make it look, but as a team, it ended up where it is, and you're going to need everybody to get better defensively as a unit to bring those numbers up. So, still responsible for it in some way, but relative to the rest of the team, certainly a lot better than Chandler Stevenson or really even Shane Wright, who we just saw. Obviously, Matty Beneers making them all look bad defensively, but that's a separate issue. Either way, I think for Tolvin, especially at less than $3.5 million, and for the role he's playing, I think you could make a good argument for an A with 23 goals, considering the issues the Kraken had scoring goals. But they did, towards the end of the season, get back up to kind of league average as far as goals per game are concerned. It just would have been nice if that could have come along a little bit earlier on in the season. Maybe it would have been in things a little bit later or had a chance down the back half. Either way, for Tolvanen, he did his part, and I'll go with an A- because, whole team effort, the defensive side could have been a little bit better, but I wouldn't fault you for wanting to bump that up to an A. Up next then, we have the captain in Jordan Eberle, who did have two kind of mini seasons that were pretty similar to each other, with the big injury and then recovery period that took out the large chunk of the middle of the season in between the two of them. But he starts out the season incredibly hot, then cools off a bit before the injury, then comes back incredibly hot before cooling off towards the end of the season. Who knows what a full season could have looked like for Eberle? Certainly know what the franchise thought, that if Eberle had been around for the full season, then he would have been a lot more of the player we saw at the start of the season, and then right when he came back, that was, again, scoring pretty close to a goal per game, even above a goal per game at points. I don't think that necessarily is terribly realistic, but it certainly would have helped the Kraken to have Eberle for more than the 42 games that he ended up playing, missing the 40 due to the injury, and a large chunk of those coming at the end of the season when the Kraken were basically already out of the playoff race anyways. So, yeah, if he's around the whole year, then maybe they are able to stay in the race a little bit longer. Who knows? I have my doubts, but I suppose there also is the leadership and the intangible locker room side of things that Eberle provides as the captain of the team, that although he was around the team throughout parts of his recovery process, it's still not the same as being out there on the bench during games and in the locker room between periods, which, depending on where he's at in recovery, he maybe can do during maybe the end of that recovery process, but certainly towards the beginning, he's not even really around the team for practices and whatnot. He's just either in the hospital after surgery or at home. For Eberle, it would have helped the team quite a bit to have him around a little bit more than he was, certainly during the part of the season that mattered. As far as the part of the season that he was around for, I mean, part of it's just, it was an incomplete season, but I think a B is probably fair. As far as the fourth line is concerned, the only player that played a significant portion of the season with the team on the fourth line and then finished the year with the team would be Tai Cartier. For Cartier, as we saw as he started to get some scratches towards the end of the season, the only reason he only plays the 63 games, there are no injuries that I can remember with Cartier. It was just kind of a lot of healthy scratches towards the end. It was a pretty inconsistent up and maybe even mostly down season for Cartier, really up until the end where he started to pick things up towards the end of the season. I gave Cartier a C+. I mean, the nice thing is that he is doing a lot of the things that we'd like to see more of the Kraken do, plays the more of that physical game, is very willing to go to the defensive teammates, all things that are fun to watch, and we'd really like to see maybe more from some of the other players. But for Cartier, he's trying to change his role from really what he had done until getting to the NHL into more of that fourth line grinding player and find his way into a consistent NHL role there. At least for now, maybe C+ is a little bit harsh. If you want to bump him up to a B-, maybe that's fair, but he certainly could have played a little bit better, more defensively responsible, and I think there's a balance that he's still trying to figure out there of when to go for those hits, when to go to the defense of a teammate, and when not to, when to play the responsible game and, not leave a guy open to go and take a puck away from somebody only to have it passed through him and leave a guy wide open or create a turnover or something like that. There's some learning in that role that I think still needs to happen for Cartier, and whether or not he gets to do that with the Kraken next season, we're just going to have to wait and see. I think there's a very real possibility that with some other guys like Yanni Newman coming up, and if the Kraken make additions on the forward end of the offseason, that just roster-wise, there might not be a space for Cartier, but that's a discussion for a later time, a later video. We'll get to that whole what things could look like for the Kraken next season here a little bit down the road. But at least for now, not a terribly great season for Cartier. And then for some of the other guys that didn't finish the season with the Kraken or didn't play a ton with them, we'll start with Alexiaak since he did finish the season with the Kraken. I really liked what I saw with Alexiaak. I would give him an A for the role that he played with the Kraken. There's honestly a decent chance that he played well enough that they at least consider the possibility of what the team could look like with him on it next year, or at least giving him a look going into training camp and see if he can earn his spot onto a fourth line role with the team. Now, he is a free agent, so if he wants to test free agency and see if there's a better role for him somewhere else out there, then maybe that still happens. He has some say in the matter as well, but the Kraken, I don't think it's out of the question that they look at trying to keep him around. And for some of the players that did play a good chunk of the season with the Kraken, but headed out at the deadline on the forward end, and then we'll get to the defensive end. Yanni Dord, again, had a pretty significant injury. I think kind of a B to maybe B minus. He wasn't having a fantastic season with the Kraken up until that injury. Still doing all the stuff that we loved from Dord, all the intangible leadership stuff, and again, the just being the pepper pot, getting in people's faces and being a pest. So it still hurt to see Dord go, but if we're being honest, things weren't going that well for him, even outside of the injury with the Kraken. I think kind of a B minus is maybe even C plus in that range for Dord as far as his time playing with the team. Meanwhile, with Bjorkstrand, the other of the two guys there that went to Tampa Bay with Alexiaak coming back in return and all the other good stuff the Kraken got in that trade. For Bjorkstrand, yeah, he had a pretty good season with the Kraken. I think an A is probably fair, maybe an A minus, but things were going pretty well for Bjorkstrand, and certainly a guy I don't think the Kraken ever really consider trading if they're anywhere near a playoff spot and have any hopes of trying to get into the playoffs with a late push there down the stretch. But considering things were over and it seemed like Bjorkstrand was ready to move on and try and, make a run at a cup with a team that had a chance, it's only fair that he ends up getting traded out, and especially considering he's probably a big part of what got the Kraken the return they did from that trade. The Kraken got a good amount of value out of a good season up to the trade deadline for Bjorkstrand. Yeah, I think an A minus is probably fair there. Brandon Tanev, this is the one I might be a little bit unfair in the other end. While there's still lots of love for Tanev, even aside from the kind of dirty hit he had on Wright in his return to Seattle, he still does a lot of the things, still played a very entertaining game for a lot of people to watch. I know he's still largely seen as a fan favorite, the wacky photo, the fast straight line big hits, always blocking shots, leading the league as far as block shots for forward is concerned. He does a lot of those gritty things that fans enjoy from a lower in the lineup type of player. And honestly, if that's all he was, just a lower in the lineup, 1 to maybe pushing 2 million, but sub 2 million contract on a fourth line role doing those things, then yeah, I'd probably be fine giving him a B or something. He really doesn't have that much as far as points production is concerned, and played a decent game defensively. But unfortunately, he was costing the Kraken $3.5 million before the trades. So, yeah, considering the fact that you really need a little bit more out of the contract that they were paying Tanev than what he was giving them, I ended up going with a D, maybe bump it up to like a D plus C minus, but I'm still kind of surprised the Kraken got the return from Winnipeg that they did, even though I understand the fan favorite aspect of Tanev that is going to make him a little bit of a blind spot for some people. Moving on, though, to the defensive end, we'll start with the top pair and the top paid defenseman for the Kraken in Vince Dunn, who did have another fantastic season offensively, did a lot of the Vince Dunn things that you see, a pretty similar season to last year, 11 goals, right around 30 assists. So yeah, for Dunn, keeps on doing his thing offensively. But defensively, for as bad as Stevenson was on the season as a whole, Dunn was maybe even, analytically speaking anyway, actually worse, which is quite a feat. Dunn was very bad defensively this season, and a lot of that was in the back half. Really, as things started to unravel for the Kraken and the season started to be slipping away more and more, Dunn seemed to be pushing more and more offensively, taking more and more risks offensively, and also just being generally less and less responsible in their own end of the ice, making ill-advised passes, which we're just not really used to seeing from Dunn when he's at his best. Usually he's quite good at starting breakouts and getting that first pass up to the Kraken blue line cleanly, or even into the neutral zone cleanly. That just wasn't happening. We were seeing a lot of Dunn trying no-look passes or bouncing passes off of boards and just putting it right onto the tape in some cases of opposing players still on the Kraken side of their own blue line, which then would come back and bite them. So for Dunn, while the offensive side is kind of what we'd expect, and that's kind of A to maybe even A+ type range offensive game that Dunn provides for the Kraken. Now that his new contract is kicked in, he's getting paid as much as he is. You also need from your defenseman, your top paired defenseman who's playing the most time on ice, or part of the pair that's spending the most time on ice of your three pairs. You need at least league average defense or close to it, and Dunn just wasn't even coming anywhere remotely close to that. So I gotta bump him down to, we'll say, a B-. I mean, the offensive side is there, but with how much he's getting paid, you need to play. And I understand, I can forgive a little bit of it just for the understanding that he was trying to press to try and make something happen for the Kraken, since it clearly wasn't working in the first half of the season. But you can only excuse so much of it, and it was just a total failure of a season on the defensive side for Dunn. So maybe even a B- is being a little bit generous, but I'll stick with it. But that being said, defensively about Dunn, it certainly didn't help him that his defensive partner in Adam Larson, who is supposed to be the defensively responsible of the two of them, well, it seems that while Larson had his defensively responsible game had been rubbing off on Dunn over the last couple of years, at least this season anyway, that bounced back in the other direction in a pretty big way, as Larson actually was pretty good for the Kraken offensively. I mean, maybe his goals and assists aren't crazy out there compared to other seasons, but analytically, and it checks out with the eye test, he was quite often pushing the Kraken into the offensive end and getting the transition going in the right direction. But defensively back the other way, especially as we got towards the back half of the season, really in the new year from January on, that defensive pair, including Dunn, but also very much including Adam Larson, was absolutely horrible defensively. For large chunks of January through February and even March, there were times where that was by far the worst defensive group that the Kraken had on the ice. It didn't matter what forward group was out there. They suffered defensively as a team when Dunn and Larson were on the ice, which they were for the majority of the time, as they are the top pair for the Kraken. And for Larson, that's pretty tough considering he is supposed to be the defensive responsible one of the two. And there are times, especially late in the season, I don't know how many different highlights of opposing goals where the player just absolutely walks one of Dunn or Larson, just goes completely around Larson, stationary, a pylon essentially in the play. And for Larson in particular, that is a little bit more uncharacteristic and something we're just not really used to seeing. I don't know if he had just checked out at that point in the season. I mean, it would be frustrating if that was the case, but I guess fair enough. But yeah, for Larson, I do kind of have to, I guess it's hard to give Dunn a B of some kind and then put Larson as a C. So maybe both of them are kind of more C+ range. You just expect more from your top pair. And really the only reason I'm not bumping Larson down lower than Dunn is because he isn't getting paid as much as Dunn is. And that is a factor in this for sure. And I'm afraid the story is going to be pretty similar as we move on to the second pair defenseman for the Kraken, starting with the second highest paid defenseman in Brandon Montour, who did have a fantastic season for the Kraken offensively, not just the analytics, but also, eye test and the traditional counting stats of goals and assists, where Montour had a career high in goals with 18 on the season, just a couple short of that nice even 20, and also a fair number of assists. Now, it is worth noting that not only was he also pretty poor defensively for the Kraken, but he also had, by a significant margin for a team that really did not spend very much time in the penalty box, the most penalty time for the Kraken, 70 minutes spent in the penalty box for Brandon Montour, which is nearing double second place on the team. So depending on how much you want to take into account time spent in the box and how much that potentially hurts the team, especially with a middling to bad penalty kill. Maybe you knock that a little bit on the defensive part of his game as well, but for Montour, at least the offensive side of the game was contributing in a big way to some success for the Kraken, and again, helping them do something that they were really having some trouble doing, putting the puck in the opposing net. So for those reasons, although defensively he had a pretty similar season to Dunn and Larson, though ever so slightly better, I will bump him up to the B+ range. If he had even around a league average defensive season, then I think we're talking about an A, maybe even an A+ season for Montour. Maybe an A considering the contract. I think you'd have to have a pretty exceptional, offensive season and be above average defensively to be talking about an A+, but I'd be pretty comfortable going with a flat out A if he was anywhere near league average defensively. Unfortunately, for the Kraken, defensive core, that was hard to come by this season. And actually, weirdly enough, of the top 4 defensemen, depending on who you think is the 4th of the top 4, but in this case, we'll say it's Riker Evans. He was, according to the advanced stats, the best defensively of the 4, which certainly doesn't seem to check out with the eye test, although that could be recency bias, as the back half, or at least the last month and a half of Riker Evans' season, was absolutely terrible defensively. He was, without question, the worst defensive player for the Kraken, at least by the eye, in the last month to month and a half of the season, really since the Three Nations break. Riker Evans was good for almost an expected goal against per game. At least it seemed that way anyway. He had a lot of very bad defensive mistakes, but the front half of the season for him was a lot better than most of his colleagues at the blue line for the Kraken, so that certainly helped the overall season number not look quite as bad there, though it still leaves a lot of room for improvement and a lot to be desired going on into the future, which I guess if you want to take a silver lining from it, maybe that poor finish to Riker Evans' season and the fact that offensively he seemed to not be producing quite in the way that we expected based on how the back half of last season went, or at least his season in the NHL last year went. That might mean that the Kraken can get him for a little bit cheaper over the next couple of years. It probably means they get him for a shorter term, lower AAV deal. We'll see what that ends up looking like as they re-sign him here in the offseason. Certainly his performance in a contract year, though, in the last month and a half is not going to help his wallet too much. Not that he'll still be doing fine, but yeah, a tough year for Evans. I ended up giving him a C+, but really, if we're talking about the season as a whole, that was some recency bias in just how poor his finish to the season was. I think it's probably fair to give Riker a B- for the year. As we move on to the third pair of defensemen, though, things do start to get slightly better as far as those defensive metrics are concerned. For Jaime Alexiaak, it was somewhat noticeably better than any of the 4 before him. But offensively, obviously, there's a big hit here. Alexiaak, very much not an offensively minded defenseman in any shape, way, or form. He doesn't really have a fantastic shot and rarely gets up into the play, although every now and then he does jump up into a play, into a rush, and make some nice play in the offensive end, and you're shocked and amazed that it just happened, and then you don't see it again for a couple of weeks, but it does happen every now and then. Either way, offensively, Alexiaak doesn't have much to offer, was a bit better defensively, but also, and this is something that was true of Larson as well that I forgot to mention, both of them had significant reductions in the number of hits they laid this season, and hits are kind of a weird stat. They're measured differently from arena to arena. It's very much a subjective thing that's measured by different arenas' scorekeepers, so there's some consistency issues there, and anyway, not a perfect stat, but when there's as significant of a decrease as we saw with both Larson and Alexiaak in physicality this season, that is something to note, and especially for a team that was struggling in their own end of the ice, maybe being a little bit more physical and taking away some of that space from opposing players or making them think about just skating around your end of the ice freely would help things a little bit. And especially with Alexiaak making 4.6 as a third, sometimes second pair, but we'll call it second and a half pair defenseman, you need a little bit more physicality for the lack of offense that you're not going to get. You can accept not getting offense from Alexiaak, especially considering you do have Montour, Dunn, apparently now Adam Larson, and even you're expecting Riker Evans to provide a little bit more offense than defense. You have plenty of offensive defensemen. You can accept that that's just not Alexiak's role on the team, but you do need him to fill that more physical role, certainly more than we've seen this season, but really even last season, his hits were down, and now they're even down significantly from that. So it's a part of his game that is a big part of his role, and that we're just not seeing enough of. So for those reasons, I think I'm going to go with, probably going to end up going with a C for Alexiaak here. It could be a little bit higher if he was more around that like $2 to $3 million range, but for the contract he's making and the role that he's supposed to be filling, I just don't think he's filling that role quite well enough at this time. Which brings us to Josh Mahura, very much the sixth of six defensemen for the Kraken this season. Mahura played pretty well for the Kraken was supposed to be a seventh defenseman coming into the year, but he was good enough in the times that he got in early on that I think he kind of made Borggan more expendable. Now, Borggan asking to get moved out because he wasn't happy with the role he had with the Kraken certainly helped that as well, and then the Rangers being willing to give the Kraken Capo Caco in return also helped that. But Mahura helped that along in his own right, was clearly a good option as a sixth defenseman, and then proved to be that throughout the rest of the season. Heck, as far as talking about filling a more physical role for a guy that was making pretty much league minimum, Mahura did that in almost half the ice time that Alexiaak had. He had significantly more hits than Alexiaak did. Now, he did block 100 fewer shots than Alexiaak did, but still the point is that he was right up there between Alexiaak and Larson in the number of hits that he laid for being a smaller player, a guy that really isn't necessarily supposed to be filling that physical role. He's just a guy that you're throwing out there for 13 and a half minutes a night to rest the legs of your top four defensemen, top five, I suppose, in this case. And some points there was times where it felt like Mahura was the best defensive defenseman that the Kraken had, and as far as the advanced analytics are concerned, they kind of agree that Mahura was the best defensive defenseman that the Kraken had, at least as far as guys that played significant number of games with the team. And again, the offensive side of the game, not really there, and you're not expecting that from a third pairing defenseman. He unfortunately finished the season without a single goal for the Kraken, but I think he more than filled his role. I'm happy to give Mahura an A. Whether or not he's back on the team next season, I seriously doubt it, though it's possible. Depending on how ready the Kraken think a prospect is coming up, the defensive side of the prospect pool is nowhere near as deep or ready in general as the offensive end is for the Kraken. But there's always the possibility that maybe they go out and get somebody in free agency or via trade. There's already a lot of money being spent on that blue line, though, and you're not necessarily looking to reduce the ice time of Larson, Dunn, Montour, or maybe even Riker Evans. So to go out and get another defenseman, unless you're just ready to shelter Evans a little bit more and stick him on a third pair pretty entirely with Alexiaak, then I don't think the Kraken necessarily go out and get any kind of big-name defenseman this season. I think they're really looking to improve things on the forward end. So there maybe is a window there where Mahura could come back and fill, again, that sixth pairing defenseman, or always have the possibility of bring Mahura back and, again, make him earn that spot, which he very well, if he plays the way he did this season, could end up doing. And then as far as the one other defenseman that played a significant number of games with the Kraken this season and ended up heading out via trade in Will Borggan, like I said, there's a reason that the Kraken were more than willing to trade Borggan and get something out of what wasn't going a season that wasn't going well for him. Fortunately, things seem to have gotten better for Borggan in New York, and we still love Will Borggan here, Belligerent Bill. For everything, all the off-the-ice stuff with being Matty's roommate and the extra content that the team put out, all the stuff that we talked about when that trade was made, the reasons that we would miss Will Borggan, things just weren't going very well for him in the season on the ice leading up to that trade. Again, we're talking kind of a C- to D for Borggan, especially considering he was making $2 to $3 million. So, yeah, for Borggan, it wasn't a good season for the Kraken, but they were able to find that trade and a mutually beneficial trade for the players, both Caco and Borggan able to kind of have resurgences after getting to their new respective teams. So then finally we can close things out with the goaltending, where there's really only two players to talk about, and one that played the vast majority of the time for the Kraken in Joey Daccord, who for a second straight season was absolutely fantastic in net. I think there's a decent chance that he was the best player for the Kraken, full stop, on the season. So far as voting is concerned, go over on Patreon. There's not a lot of people disagreeing with me. An early spoiler for where we could be looking as far as Kraken MVP, but Daccord already earned that from Seattle media and, could be earning that here on the channel. It was a fantastic season for Daccord, and his .906 save percentage is a decent step down from the .916 the year before, but as we just saw from the defensive core and even the forward end, he wasn't getting a whole lot of help defensively from the skaters in front of him, really aside from Matty Beneers. It was kind of left on an island, especially late in the season. There were times where he was getting no help whatsoever, and yeah, he didn't look as sharp from kind of the return from the Four Nations through the middle of March. There was kind of a month in there that Daccord looked human, NHL average, maybe even slightly lower than, though I think you can attribute the slightly lower than to just how things were being played in front of him. But throughout the rest of the season leading up to that break, and then even the last few weeks of the season, Daccord is really the only reason that the Kraken even ended up getting to 30 wins, much less the 35 that I want to say they finished with. I should probably know that off the top of my head, but either way, Daccord, for the people that were Team Tank, Daccord is the only reason the Kraken stayed with any chance of maybe making a run into the middle of the season. And he's, the only reason that the Kraken aren't picking in the top 3 as we get to the end of it. So, depending on how you look at that, I suppose it's an upside or a downside. The good news for the Kraken is that they do have a legitimate, I feel, pretty safe to say, top 10 NHL goaltender going forward. And it does help prove that last year wasn't just a fluke good season for Daccord, that this is maybe just who he is as a goaltender. And obviously goaltending comes and goes, and guys can have a couple of good seasons and then just fall off the face of the earth. So who really knows as far as goaltending is concerned, but 2 back-to-back good to even borderline elite seasons from Daccord is certainly a hopeful picture for the guy in the net for the Kraken going forward. That does bring us, though, to the other half of the goaltending tandem for the Kraken and their real true backup this season in Philip Grubauer, who had another tough year. And a lot of it was just due to the fact that, again, not getting a lot of help from the skating in front of him. Defensive metrics would point to the fact that, the Kraken were pretty bad defensively this year. And it seemed like they were worse in front of Grubauer. Now, it seemed like the Kraken are defensively worse in front of Grubauer pretty much the entire time he's been with the Kraken, except for that playoff season. And some of that some of that just has to be Grubauer. But at the same time, it doesn't help that he was getting almost a goal per game less goal support than Daccord. There are some, I think, genuine, real excuses, but fair excuses that you can make for the discrepancy between Daccord's numbers and Grubauer's numbers. And generally, I think the win-loss stat for a goaltender is one of the absolute worst stats in all of sports. It says something when Daccord has a 4 games north of NHL 500 record on the season, and the team still finishes picking 6th in the draft, and really Grubauer is the only other one starting significant number of games. The Kraken just did not win when Grubauer was in net, and while it wasn't always his fault, there were times where, especially that game against the Sharks, he was just an absolute non-option. And there are a lot of fond memories of Grubauer in Seattle, and it's one of those things. It'll be sad to see him go, I think, for a lot of us. He was the first starter for the Kraken, the first goaltender that we had here in Seattle. I think we've seen the last of Grubauer. We've said that before, and it's probably for the best. Which does mean that, unlike Burkovski, who I don't think at this point is likely to get bought out, Grubauer, who does still have some time left on his contract, will have to get bought out. And when you get to a point where a player is getting bought out, that obviously means that their contract is just nowhere near what their performance is, worthy of. And for that, I think Grubauer just kind of has to get a D. It's the same grade that I ended up giving Burkovski. So, yeah, 2 tough seasons there. Yeah, I don't know. I don't want to absolutely roast Grubauer too much because I don't necessarily think that he was always as bad as his numbers looked. Just the team in front of him was not always playing very good defensively. But we know now what a good goaltender can do even behind a subpar defensive effort in front of him, as we've seen with Dord. And it would be one thing if Grubauer is making around $3 million a year. It still would kind of not be worth what the Kraken were getting from him, but that's reasonable for a second goaltender or backup goaltender. You could just keep him for that. But for the money that he was making, yeah, it's hard. I mean, I think an F might even be reasonable, but I'll go with a D. With that, though, let me know what you think down in the comment section below. If there's any of these grades that you would drastically disagree with, feel free to throw any of your own grades down there, as much or as little as you'd like to give out. Any of your just general thoughts on the season. And one last time, I do have some of these polls up on Patreon for the Kraken Awards. This is your last chance to get into Patreon if you want to help decide those Kraken Awards. The polls are up. The threads are there. I might even throw a couple of other ones up there for the fun of it, but Kraken Awards will be coming out here soon, and, well, unfortunately, the playoffs have started out without the Kraken involved, and hopefully for the last time in quite a while. If that is going to happen, though, the Kraken as a whole will need to get better defensively. They'll need a little bit better backup goaltending, and they'll need some offensive steps forward from some of these players. Until next time, though, stay safe out there, be good to each other, God bless, and go Kraken.